Hello, history friends. We've got our chapter 28 test here. Starts with part 1, multiple choice. In 1960, blank was the youngest person to be elected as president. Is that Richard Nixon, Lyndon B. Johnson, or John F. Kennedy? Next question. Event in which President Kennedy ordered the training of Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and kick Fidel Castro out of power. Is that the Cuban Missile Crisis, the space race, or the Bay of Pigs invasion? Event in which President Kennedy ordered a quarantine of Cuba to stop Soviet ships and putting warheads on the island. Cuban Missile Crisis, space race, or Bay of Pigs invasion? Blank was built to separate East Berlin and West Berlin. Ampelman, Berlin Wall, Berlin Airlift. Which U.S. president was assassinated during a campaign event in Dallas, Texas? Dwight D. Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson. Nation of Islam leader who urged blacks to separate from white society. Emmett Till, Dr. King, Malcolm X. Which of the following is not associated with the Black Power movement? Malcolm X, Black Panthers, Dr. King. Which best describes the strategy of Malcolm X in fighting for equal rights, truth and nonviolence, by any means necessary, work with other races toward a common goal? The blank armed citizens with weapons and instructed them to keep African American neighborhoods safe from police. De facto segregation, Black Panthers, freedom rides. People who rode buses around the South and drew attention to segregation were known as suffragists, freedom riders, Black Panthers. Johnson's economic programs, known as the blank, consist of Medicare, Elementary and Secondary School Act, and more. Is that the New Deal, the Fair Deal, or the Great Society? Which of the following groups was intended to benefit the most from the Great Society programs? Minorities and poor, white middle-class families, farmers, and laborers. The Organization of Farm Workers under the leadership of Cesar Chavez did what? Helped pass the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, become heavily involved in pushing for women's rights, or improve the pay and benefits of farm workers by boycotting farmers. Which of the following statements accurately describes the counterculture movement? Movement of white middle-class college youth who are disillusioned with the war, idealistic youths who wanted a society full of peace and love, or all of the above? Members of youth movement counterculture, known as blank, wore their hair long, listened to rock, and attended Woodstock. Is that the baby boomers, the hippies, or the preppies? What spurred the reawakening of the women's movement during the 1960s? An increase in the political activism of the times, a closing of the gap between men's incomes and women's incomes, women gaining the right to vote in 1920. Which of the following events led to the start of the LGBTQ plus civil rights movement? The Stonewall riots in New York City, Harvey Milk's assassination, or protests against the LGBTQ plus community? On July 20th, 1969, blank was the first man to walk on the moon. Buzz Aldrin, John Glenn, Neil Armstrong. Which statement best describes America's viewpoints of the Vietnam War? The American people were united in their support for the Vietnam War. Many Americans protested against the nation's involvement in the war, or most Americans supported the government of North Vietnam. Blank was assassinated during his campaign for the Democratic president's nomination. He is brother of the former president. Is that John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, or Dr. King? Blank was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. Riots and acts of violence broke out following this event. John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, or Martin Luther King Jr.? Republican candidate elected in 1968 with the theme Bring Us Together. Is that Richard Nixon, Hubert Humphrey, or George Wallace? Part 2 of our test is a document-based reading. Read the passage and then answer the questions. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This is an excerpt from a letter from the Birmingham jail in 1963. So he wrote this while he was spending time in jail after one of the many times he was arrested. He says, "My dear fellow clergymen, while confined here in the Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling my present activities unwise and untimely. Seldom do I pause to answer criticism of my work and ideas. If I sought to answer all the criticisms that cross my desk, my secretaries would have little time for anything other than such correspondence in the course of the day, and I would have no time for constructive work. But since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill and that your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I want to try to answer your statements in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms. I think I should indicate why I am here in Birmingham, since you have been influenced by the view which argues against outsiders coming in. I have the honor of serving as president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization operating in every southern state with headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. We have some 85 affiliated organizations across the South, and one of them is the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. Frequently, we share staff, educational, and financial resources with our affiliates. Several months ago, the affiliate here in Birmingham asked us to be on call to engage in a nonviolent direct action program if such were deemed necessary. We readily consented, and when the hour came, we lived up to our promise. So I, along with several members of my staff, am here because I was invited here. I am here because I have organizational ties here. But more basically, I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the prophets of the 8th century BC left their villages and carried their "Thus said the Lord" far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the Apostle Paul left his village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to the far corners of the Greco-Roman world, so am I compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my own hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid. Moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutually tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow provincial outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its boundaries. Who is the audience in Dr. King's letter? So who did he write the letter to? Supreme Court justices, other ministers or clergymen like himself, all whites in the South, or fellow prisoners in the jail? Which of the following is not a reason why Dr. King was in Birmingham? He was invited there. He has organized ties there. This is his hometown. Injustice is there. In the last paragraph, what does the word cognizant mean? So if we go back to the reading, where does it say that for us? Moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. So what does he mean when he uses the word cognizant? Aware, confused, confident, rebellious? From the last paragraph, it can be inferred that Dr. King would most likely agree with which of the following statements. People whose families immigrated to America should be considered outsiders, and they should have no rights in America. Living in Atlanta, Georgia means he does not need to be concerned with what is happening to African Americans in Birmingham, Alabama. Violent tactics should be used in Birmingham to get the civil rights leaders' message across to the Southern whites, or everyone who lives in America and is an American citizen should be afforded the same rights no matter what their race, gender, age, or where they live in America. The overall tone of this passage can be described as serious and stern, joyous and excited, sad and depressed, angry and violent. According to the passage, which of the following is not something that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference shares with its affiliates or groups? Staff, educational resources, uniforms, financial resources. Okay, friends, part 3 is cartoon analysis. It's the last part of the test. The caption for this cartoon is, "What shall I put down as reason for dying?" I want you to look at the two men in the bottom and look at the crosses. Each one of them says, "Killed in Vietnam." Think about who those two men might be. What is the main idea of this political cartoon? Who would agree with this cartoon and why? Make sure you put the why part. And when you're ready, the last question says, who would disagree with this cartoon and why? When you're finished, please hit submit. Thank you.